The Civil War, Part 3. Let's look at an external explanation of the war's outcome that is valid. The North had superior presidential leadership. At first, the North's war objective was simply to restore the Union. The North's goal was not to end slavery, but simply to preserve the Union as it was, half slave, half free. But as the war dragged out, the North gradually adopted more and more radical strategies in order to win. And the most radical strategy or move of all was to emancipate the slaves. As the war dragged on, the abolitionists pressured President Lincoln to emancipate. "Mr. President, you must strike at the cause of the war. Why fight this costly war without removing the cause?" Lincoln personally sympathized with emancipation, but he knew much of the Northern public did not. It was too racist and anti-black. Many in the North would support a war for the Union, but they would not support a war for emancipation. Remember, there were 4 slave states that fought with the North: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. Lincoln could not afford to lose them. Nor did the president really have any legal or constitutional authority to emancipate the slaves. That would be confiscating people's property without due process of law. The president can't just do that because he wants to. In the end, Lincoln timed and justified emancipation brilliantly, and that is a key to his greatness as president. Lincoln justified emancipation as a military measure necessary to win the war. It was seizing and confiscating enemy property. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to areas that were in rebellion, because the president is seizing and confiscating enemy property, the slaves. Lincoln sold emancipation as a measure that would win the war, because that's the only way the Northern people would support it. Emancipation would strengthen the North, weaken the South, and win the war. Think about it this way. At the outset of the war, the population of the North, 20 million, the South, 10 million, with 4 million of the Southern people being enslaved. And so the North has a 2-to-1 advantage in manpower. That's good, but not good enough to win. Now, those 4 million enslaved people in the South, that's the Confederate labor force, growing food to feed Confederate armies and keep the Southern War going. Before emancipation, those slaves, those enslaved people, they don't care who wins the war because it doesn't affect them. But if Lincoln emancipates the slaves, those enslaved people now want the North to win, so they'll be free. Now they have a dog in this race. They will subtract their labor from the South and add it to the North. How will they do that? Throwing down their tools, refusing to work, running away to Union military lines, and ultimately becoming Northern soldiers in the war and tipping the balance against the South. So if President Lincoln emancipates the slaves, it's like subtracting 4 million people from the South and adding them to the North, which makes the North have 24 million people and the South only 6 million people. So what emancipation does really is it takes the North's 2-to-1 advantage in manpower and transforms it into a 4-to-1 advantage in manpower, and that is enough to win. Now, when I was in high school, I was taught by my history teacher, quote, "The Emancipation Proclamation was meaningless because Lincoln was not freeing the slaves where he could free them, and he was freeing the slaves where he could not free them. This is what I was taught by my history teacher in high school, and I think it's completely wrong. Let's take this apart. The Emancipation Proclamation was meaningless because Lincoln was not freeing the slaves where he could free them. That refers to the 4 slave states that stayed with the North: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. But Lincoln couldn't free the slaves there because those states were loyal, and the whole justification for emancipation is seizing enemy property in wartime. And then the rest of the statement, and he was freeing the slaves where he could not free them. That refers to Lincoln trying to free slaves in a foreign country, the Confederate States of America. But that's false too, because word spread. Word spread through the South of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the slaves enforced it for President Lincoln. Again, they threw down their tools, refused to work, became unmanageable, ran away to Union military lines, and eventually became Union soldiers. 180,000 African Americans fought for the North in the Civil War, mostly former slaves, and they tipped the balance against the South and helped to win the war. So what I was taught by my history teacher in high school, I think, is totally wrong. There were, however, 2 problems with the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't free the slaves in Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And so how did those slaves become free? With the 13th Amendment ending slavery, unless the state did it on its own sooner than that. The other problem with the Emancipation Proclamation, it is a presidential executive order of dubious constitutionality to seize people's property and confiscate it permanently without due process of law. Lincoln was worried that after the Civil War was over, a Southern slaveholder might bring a case before the Supreme Court and say, "The Emancipation Proclamation was unconstitutional. I want my slaves back." How is that problem solved? The same answer, the 13th Amendment. What the 13th Amendment does is to legitimize and constitutionalize the emancipation of the slaves. That's why Lincoln fought so hard for the 13th Amendment ending slavery. No, this is not Abraham Lincoln. This is Daniel Day-Lewis playing Abraham Lincoln in Spielberg's Lincoln. But that film is all about Lincoln's fight for the 13th Amendment. So an external explanation of the war's outcome would be that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation crippled the South. This is an external explanation that is valid, something the North did right. An external explanation that is valid, true, and accurate. The North had superior presidential leadership. The North also had superior military leadership. At first, President Lincoln's generals fought a limited war. All they did was to try and capture Confederate territory. And the North really got nowhere. The North didn't really start to win this war until it found a general who understood the way to win the war was to destroy Southern armies. And that general was General Ulysses Grant. Grant won the Civil War not by capturing territory, but by destroying Robert E. Lee's army. The North also adopted total war, to take the war directly to the Southern civilian population. The very definition of total war is to make war on the civilian population, to break down the distinction between soldier and civilian. The best example of total war would be General William Tecumseh Sherman's famous March to the Sea. General Sherman believed that the North not only needed to break Southern armies, but to break the will and spirit of the Southern people. The North needed to break the Southern people's will and ability to fight. In late 1864, November, December 1864, General Sherman marched an army of 60,000 men nearly 300 miles across Georgia from Atlanta all the way to Savannah on the coast. Sherman's army went about 10 miles a day. They covered a path about 50 miles wide, and as they went, they destroyed everything in sight. Burned farms, slaughtered livestock, tore up railroad tracks, and liberated slaves. When the Southern people complained, "You can't fight this way. This isn't civilized warfare," Sherman had a lecture ready for the Southern people. And basically what Sherman said was, "Aw, isn't this a shame? You should have thought about this before you started this cruel war. But now, you Southern people, you started it, we're going to finish it, and we're going to finish it our way." The impact of Sherman's march was largely psychological. By rampaging through the enemy heartland, he convinced Southerners that they were beaten. The march broke the spirit of the Confederacy and brought the Southern people to their knees. One indication of this, Confederate desertion from Confederate armies, about the same as Union Northern desertion until late 1864, the time of Sherman's march. And then Confederate desertion skyrockets. By late 1864, one half of the Confederate Army was AWOL, absent without leave. In April 1865, Robert E. Lee's army surrendered to Grant at a place in Virginia called Appomattox, ending the war. So here's a private home in the town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where Lee surrendered to Grant, ending the war. The best explanation of the war's outcome is an external one. The North possessed superior leadership, especially Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman. The North defeated the South not with superior resources, but with superior presidential and military leadership.